Hello and welcome to the edition from The Spectator. I'm William Moore, The Spectator's features editor. The latest issue of the magazine has just gone to print, and to talk about what's in it, I'm delighted to be joined by The Spectator writer Matthew Parris, our opinion editor Rupert Hawksley, and the Whitehall editor of the Financial Times, Lucy Fisher. This week's cover piece is Defenceless, and in it, Tim Shipman reflects on the grim state of Britain's armed forces. Well, Lucy, I'd love to start by coming to you. We're a week on now from the Munich security conference in which we heard about all these threats to Britain, all these renewed warnings. Does the state of Britain's armed forces concern you, as Tim describes in detail in the piece?
Well, look, it's a really important piece by Tim that I think brings to the fore several problems facing the government here. The first and most obvious one is around funding. There is this funding gap of around £28 billion over the next decade for the government to fulfil its flagship strategic defence review that came out last year. And the government, in a classic sort of Whitehall trick, brought out the shopping list of what it needs to defend the country, and then said, we'll come later with the document with all the sort of the costings and showing you how we fund all this. That document was supposed to arrive in the autumn. It's been repeatedly delayed. It actually refers to the financial year starting in April, so we're really getting to crunch time now as to whether this defence investment plan will come next month or whether it will be delayed heading into Purdah onto the other side of the local elections. And essentially, it's a really difficult problem for Starmer because he's trying, on the one hand, to sort of say that the UK is going to take up this leadership role in European NATO, as people are increasingly talking about it. Very well rehearsed, the US intention to draw down military resources in the neighbourhood, in the region, and leave Europe, to be more responsible for its own security. On the other hand, this funding gap at a time when we're seeing so many allies across Europe, particularly Germany, particularly Poland, racing towards, really hefty spending commitments. I think, Poland's on track to get to 5% of GDP. There's a real gap there between the rhetoric and the reality. And another thing I think it was really important that Tim drew out in this piece is Starmer doing enough to explain to the public how dire the threat that the UK and Europe is facing, particularly from Russia, is? And that's related to the funding, because you need to pitch roll, you need to bring the public with you in order to essentially borrow, raise taxes, or divert money away from other priorities like welfare to warfare. So there's more, I think, that the Prime Minister needs to do to kind of drive that home to the public and make clear why he's going to need to find this money from somewhere.
Yes, well, there's that great anecdote that starts Tim's piece about how Keir Starmer, when he got the Strategic Defence Review, the costings for it, he put his head in his hands and snapped, why are you showing me this now? I thought this was meant to be costed.
Yes. I find that rather alarming. The Prime Minister didn't appear to be across what was going on. There appeared to be some kind of tension. There always is with the Treasury, but the Prime Minister's job is to overrule the Treasury when necessary, the Treasury only doing their job. And there were two facts or figures that alarmed me in the piece. I'm not a defence expert. One, that something like only 25% of the British public feel that we are not doing enough to defend ourselves from the future possibilities. And the other one was that if you subtract our not entirely independent nuclear deterrent from our spending, we're right down there with Spain.
Yes, only 1.75% of GDP spent on defence, which, as Tim points out, that means that Britain's on course to fall to being the 21st state in the list in terms of NATO defence spending, proportionately speaking, which is obviously pretty dire since we used to be second, after America.
Let's pick up on one of Lucy's points, which I thought was really interesting, and it's this idea that you need to pitch roll. And again, in Tim's piece, it's something like 25% only support tax rises to fund defence spending. The appetite really isn't there at the moment. And I would sort of agree with you that Starmer just hasn't done enough to drive home how serious the situation is. And unless you do that, it's impossible for people to get on side with it, which I think plays into the recruitment problems that the army is going to face. It's all very well spending all this money on machinery and material, but realistically, without the people to do it and to operate that machinery, it's kind of pointless. I was impressed that the Netherlands and Poland are introducing national service. I always thought it was a real shame that when Rishi Sunak suggested that in the previous
much derided.
Campaign, it was much derided, and I can understand why. Lots of young people feel that they've been screwed over, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, by the older generation. Why should they now go out and fight? But needs must, and I would certainly put my head on the line and say that I think national service would be a great thing to introduce.
You'd sign up to it straight away, would you?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm getting too old for that, Will. I think I might be part of the older generation now.
Yeah, so we're at liberty to recommend these things, aren't we?
Exactly.
But there's that poll, isn't there, that Tim quotes in his piece about saying that a third of young people say they wouldn't fight for their country.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I remembered reading many, many years ago that not long before the Second World War, the Oxford Union had a debate, would we take up arms to defend king and country, and the proposition was lost. Perhaps until we really feel we are staring down the barrel of a gun, we're just not going to take these things seriously enough.
Yes.
I think also one of the big debates now about the modernisation of our forces is what the ratio between people and autonomous systems, not just drones, but undersea self-crewed or uncrewed, submersibles and boats as well. And I think that's one of the key lessons from Ukraine, isn't it? That you can actually afford to keep a lot of your people away from the front line in the meat grinder and use technology, which is becoming increasingly capable from AI to do lots of the sort of the hard work.
Well, so you think maybe we'll need less manpower
with wages and pensions, and of course that makes kit more expensive. If you've got an armoured vehicle that has people in, you need to make sure that is a vehicle that can be rescued, that can be brought back to safety. You need evacuation plans for wounded personnel. If it's uncrewed, you can have cheaper kit that can just be sacrificed as a sort of one-way attack system.
Yes, but the Ukrainians haven't found that they need fewer people.
I mean, on the point about a kind of reluctance of the public to support increased defence spending, do you think that that's in some ways a hangover in the public mind from military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and people just now associate perhaps higher defence spending with pointless foreign wars that aren't actually a threat to security here back home?
Yeah, I agree, it's a good point. I think there probably is a lot of that there's been this sort of adventurism, interventions in sort of far-off places abroad where the UK didn't necessarily have to get involved. And I think that there is a hangover in people's minds about that. And of course, the underpinnings, the justification for the Iraq war now look, very thin indeed. And on top of that, people aren't schooled in history. We've enjoyed this huge peace dividend since the end of the Cold War. And governments want to concentrate on the spending towards education, welfare, health, that we've used that dividend on, because that's a good retail offer to the public. They want to remind people these are the ways we're improving those public services that touch your lives daily. I think sort of reminding people about the threat from Russia and doing a bit more to talk about how they're attacking us now. Cyber attacks are knocking percentage points off our economy. And often these are state-affiliated sort of cyber criminal groups. These attacks on underwater cables, our energy bills obviously have spiked following the Ukraine war as well. So I think there are multiple ways in which the government could tell a better narrative about the threat picture that might make people feel a bit more minded to spend more.
I think Tim touches on this in his piece, but I mean, that surely is a great political opportunity for Starmer as well, to be a kind of, if not a wartime leader, at least a pre-wartime leader, And is that like an opportunity that he's fluffing at the moment?
Well, you could say that. You could equally say that just at the time when we need somebody who could lead public opinion,
yes.
We've got a Prime Minister who has no particular skill at that.
Yeah, interesting.
Do you think that other NATO countries are waking up to a lot of this? I mean, you've mentioned Poland, for example, but it struck me at the Munich Security Conference how Friedrich Merz said, here's the uncomfortable truth. J.D. Vance was right, that Europe needs to up its defence spending and have been relying on this peace dividend for too long, have been relying on America for too long. Are we seeing a wake-up call across all of the continent?
I think we are. And I also think to other capitals in Europe, the answer is partly more integration on collective defence. So whereas last year talks on the UK joining this European-wide procurement mechanism SAFE stalled because the French were pushing for this high price tag for UK accession, those talks look like they're now going to sort of restart, and the mood music is it's on track for the UK to join that scheme. I've spoken to other government officials who are very interested in the idea of another sort of multilateral defence mechanism that could finance and oversee joint rearmament. And the point of that is it will help drive down costs. At the moment, because it's so fragmented, defence procurement across Europe, you have both horrendous duplication in some areas and then gaps in other areas. And frankly, many of the defence companies seem to be sort of running rings around, individual governments. So, to my mind, it is a sound logic that you would drive down the cost by doing it collectively.
It's interesting. Memory doesn't need to go back a great deal to a time when any idea of an integrated European defence effort was horrified Conservatives. Particularly, anybody who was against our membership of the European Union was automatically against any idea like that. And so, ironically, now we're not in the European Union, we seem to be warming to the idea.
But I think Conservatives with a capital C would still oppose this idea, don't you,
would
Matthew?
they?
Of a European army?
Good question.
Well,
Yes.
Yeah. Shall we move on to talking about your column this week, Matthew? I think you've probably written the most controversial thing in The Spectator this week, which is essentially arguing about not judging a person based solely on the character of the friends that he or she keeps. And of course, this is in the context of Peter Mandelson. So I wondered if you want to just elaborate upon your argument a bit for our listeners and viewers.
Well, one should preface these remarks by saying that I yield to nobody in my detestation of Jeffrey Epstein, everything that he was, everything he was up to, all the awful things that happened, and a lot of the rather bad people who are complicit in them. But complicity, to me, doesn't necessarily include simply knowing somebody or having been friends with them before you knew entirely what they were up to. And it certainly doesn't include knowing somebody who knew somebody. And we seem to be spreading the net wider and wider. Did Ben Wegg-Prosser, who was in charge of Global Council, which was Peter Mandelson's outfit, Peter Mandelson obliged Ben Wegg-Prosser, who was quite doubtful about it, and I know Ben Wegg-Prosser, to spend 25 minutes talking to Epstein. And now Ben Wegg-Prosser has had to resign from Global Council because he spent 25 minutes talking to a man he didn't particularly want to talk to in the first place. And I've visited friends in prison all my life. It is not to condone somebody's crimes to visit them in prison. And I there is a bit of a wave of public moral panic going on that I think needs calming.
Though in the case of Mandelson, though, isn't it a little bit different if he is proven to have leaked this confidential information? I mean, even putting aside the kind of continued friendship with Epstein, even after we knew more about what Epstein was getting up to, but the fact that Mandelson was leaking the information is surely pretty bad.
Yes, it doesn't look very good. I expect it's always gone on. It's just that we have the internet now, we have social media, we have WhatsApp, and you can look at everything that anybody has communicated to anybody else. It's probably not unusual that in the leather armchairs of London clubs on Pall Mall, senior members of the government talked to senior people in business and industry and occasionally gave them a little bit of a heads up on this, that and the other. I mean, there may be a legal case arising from what Peter Mandelson told Epstein. So I tread with care, but I'm not sure that any of this approaches the level of criminality. Just gossip, really. The
column can be sort of looked at in two parts, really. You've got the Epstein-Mandelson issue in the first part of the column, which I think is one issue, and I have very little sympathy for Mandelson now that we know that he was aware. But I think the second part of the column is more nuanced, and there are lots of people, white-collar crime, etc., who have made mistakes. And I think, people who have made mistakes in their time of need the support of their friends more than ever. To desert them in that period seems to me
And I think it is also, it's within the experience of most of us in our private, personal lives that we have had a bit of a bad feeling about somebody. We've thought there's something a bit wrong here, perhaps something's going wrong there, and we haven't always acted, and you don't always, because sometimes you're wrong.
Yeah, Matthew, I felt I liked you even more after reading your column because I liked your inclination to stand by your friends. I think I, like you, prize loyalty, and I think to check in on a friend who may have fallen into disgrace is in many ways admirable, depending on what the disgrace is. And you bring forward some great examples of your personal friends. I think someone who went to prison for drugs, someone who went to prison for fraud. To my mind, there's a bit of false moral equivalence to sort of sticking by someone. You know, Mandelson maintained a very close friendship with Epstein after he had been convicted for soliciting prostitution from a minor. He was on the sex register, he had been convicted, and that, to my mind, is a sort of is a different level. You know, I don't like to cast judgment or sort of stand on a podium casting about moral disgust, but I think in this instance, Epstein's crimes were severe and were known about, and therefore Mandelson choosing to stay in contact with him. I should also say I've been part of the FT team reporting on Global Counsel and Weg Prosser, and again I'm aware that there was contact with Epstein about setting up the business. There was indirect contact from Ben Weg-Prosser via Mandelson seeking input from Jeffrey Epstein on a specific deal. So I think that it is worth bringing these things into the disinfectant of the light. They are worthy of reporting, but not all cases are equal, would be my point. And sticking by a friend who's done wrong in the round, I think, is normally a sort of really admirable thing.
Well, I think we can sort of draw two examples of that from this issue. You know, you've got the Mandelson association with Epstein, which I agree with you is morally repugnant and essentially unforgivable, or unforgivable, I should say. And then later on in the magazine, Toby Young writes about how Hope Not Hate want to investigate some emails that he sent to Ghislaine Maxwell many, many years ago. Now, those emails, as far as I know, and as far as Toby seems to say in his column, were a non-event. And I think actually what happens is that you get a situation like Mandelson, and then as Matthew says in his column, by association, the web spins ever wider. And it's like, where does it stop? I think, you know, as you say, there's this element of moral equivalence, which I think is problematic, but actually there's a danger that, you know, the mood becomes one of sort of bloodlust almost, you know, and I think that's not a good place to go.
Lucy, perhaps on the subject of bloodlust, I mean, the Mandelson scandal looked a week or so ago like it was about to topple Keir Starmer's premiership. It seems to he's weathered it, at least for now, but I would love to know, as Whitehall editor, do you think it would come, you know, maybe come after local elections, or at some other point, will it just finally finish him off?
I think everyone in Westminster and Whitehall is bracing to see what is in these disclosure documents around the messages between Peter Mandelson during his time as ambassador and everyone else in government, whether they're ministers, advisors, civil servants. And I've spoken to people who've checked their own messages and sort of heaved a sigh of relief, but then realised that they may have been at a dinner, for example, and said, you know, something inopportune about the Prime Minister that could have been reported in indirect speech by a colleague to Mandelson. So,
in another WhatsApp message.
In another WhatsApp message. So people are very worried about what's going to come out. And I think at a time when the narrative around Starmer is that he thinks he's in charge, but it's it's a driverless train. Any messages of people who are supposedly his sort of closest allies in the cabinet or advisors who sort of saying, you know, playing into that narrative, I think will be really damaging. And in particular, I think people want to see what was said between Morgan McSweeney, the recently departed Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, who was known to be a protege of Mandelson's. And I think it could yet be a really, really sticky moment for Starmer when that all comes out.
Matthew, you wrote a book about great parliamentary scandals. In fact, Peter Mandelson's even in it. I mean, for previous, in a whole other previous life. I mean, how would the current Mandelson scandal, how would that rank in your book if you were to write a new chapter for it today?
I think it's pretty big.
Yeah.
I know I've tended to be on the side of saying calm down, but it's pretty big. You could argue that it's bigger than Profumo, but that's not so much a measure of the hugeness of this scandal as a measure of the extent to which the Profumo scandal was rather overblown. There never was any suggestion that any secrets were passed in pillow talk between John Profumo and Christine Keeler. But it was just irresistible to the press because there were swimming pools and there was sex and there were people dying. And we had a government, I think, that was thought to be becoming rather rotten and degenerate, and this just seemed to illustrate exactly what people felt about a Conservative government that had gone on for too long. It's fair to say, I think, that the Financial Times has kind of led the charge against Peter Mandelson for quite a long time now, actually before a lot of the latest stuff came out.
Yes.
Did it start at that lunch with Peter Mandelson where he was so rude to the Financial Times?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. So no, it predates that. So it was my colleague Jim Pickard, Deputy Political Editor at the FT, who first uncovered the fact that Mandelson stayed in Jeffrey Epstein's mansion in New York after his conviction, Epstein's conviction that I mentioned. That came out in 2023. Jim did more digging. He also asked Keir Starmer about it at a press conference in 2024, while Starmer was still leader of the opposition. So Starmer's claim he didn't know anything about this, can't be held up. And indeed, Starmer has said that he didn't know the full extent of it, but he did know something of the relationship between Mandelson and Epstein. It was a year ago that another colleague of mine, George Parker, the political editor, was interviewing Mandelson just before he went off to the US to become ambassador. And of course, like any responsible reporter, had to put to Mandelson the Epstein question, as it's become known. And Mandelson told him to F off. And said it was an FT obsession. So, so yes, that is on record.
Rupert, you've written a piece for the magazine this week as well about organised rural gangs that are plaguing communities in the countryside. And you went on patrol with Wiltshire Police. What's been going on?
Yeah, so this story started out as an investigation into the rise of hare coursing across the country. I'm sure the readers and listeners will know, but hare coursing is when you essentially chase hares with either lurchers or greyhounds, and quite often bet on which dog will catch and kill the hare first. But anyway, look, that's a serious problem across much of the countryside at the moment. 21.8% rise in Wiltshire in the last year. So it started off as a look into that and what was driving it. But what became obvious as the conversation started to open up is that rural crime more broadly is a fundamental issue. Which the government, I don't think, is doing anything like enough about. What was really striking is that I sort of assumed that rural and countryside crime would be mostly opportunistic. You might get someone who nicks a quad bike after a night out at the pub or drives off in a tractor. But what we're seeing now is organised crime groups with clear links to Eastern Europe and China actually using drones and scooters and other forms of surveillance to steal very, very expensive, very heavy machinery, which is being found within 12, 24, 48 hours across Europe, Africa, China. It's essentially, a bit of a David and Goliath situation. You've got these extraordinarily well-funded and well-organised organised crime groups up against a police force that has been, to use a phrase from earlier in the conversation, completely hollowed out. They are trying to do more about it. There's a new rural and wildlife crime strategy. I interviewed the lead for that, DCC Harrison, and they are trying to fight fire with fire. They're bringing in new technology, new DNA investigations. Rural Affairs Minister Angela Regal has said plenty of positive things about what they're doing, but the reality is that there are vast ways of the countryside where stuff is going on and the police cannot cover the ground. I think essentially most people assume that crime is happening in urban environments. What I hope this piece illustrates is that not only is it happening across the countryside, but it is getting significantly worse.
Why is it on the rise and getting worse at this rate? What's going on there?
It's the organised crime element, which I think is so different from before. And I think also, as members of Wiltshire Police told me, police funding is so low, so that more and more of the police officers are being drawn into urban environments, leaving the countryside even more exposed than it has been. The farmers aren't entirely blameless in all of this. Their approach to security and safety is not always what it might be, and I think there needs to be greater links between the farming community and the policing community, where trust is essentially broken down, so that farmers take more responsibility for security. But it's a really sad state of affairs where, I say in the piece that this, once green and pleasant land really feels like it's a crime hotspot now.
Yeah. I think your piece is particularly important in light of the fact that crime is actually, although none of our readers will ever believe this, crime is falling across the country, and burglary is falling across the country, but not in the countryside. Yeah. And it also reflects something that perhaps townies, I live in the countryside, haven't entirely understood, the increasing mechanisation of farming. One of the reasons why more equipment is being stolen in rural areas is there's much more to steal than there ever used to be. Yeah. It only starts with quad bikes, but they're these enormous things.
Yeah, I mean, a combine harvester could be £500,000 easily, tractors, anything from 100 to 300,000. There was an interesting conversation with someone at Wiltshire Police saying that, what was once county lines and drugs crimes is now no longer paying in the same way that exporting heavy machinery is. So, I don't think these OCGs are discerning in any way. That's where the money is, basically.
Are you getting wind of any of the things that Rupert is writing about in your area of?
No, but my part of Derbyshire is small farms, 300, 400, even less acres. It's all grazing. There's not a lot of crops. So my part of Derbyshire, it's still farmers' tool sheds, everybody's tool sheds. And I've never met a farmer who hasn't lost the contents of a tool shed. It happens all the time.
Yes.
I would say, Rupert, I'm a Wiltshire Wurzel by upbringing.
Yes, nice.
Very glad to see you out with the constabulary there. When I started reading about the start of your article about hare coursing, my childhood was lamping was big.
Exactly.
I thought, this is local lads going out for a night of cheap entertainment. And then you read, most people think this is just local lads going out for a night of cheap entertainment, and they are wrong. Yes. And I had no idea that it's being live streamed. It's big in China. People betting on which lurcher is going to sort of take down the animal.
Yeah, that was certainly the most interesting element of it. Is that so much of what's driving it is the amount of money being bet on which of these dogs will catch the hare first, and also if you have a particularly good dog, you can then show videos of that dog hare coursing and sell it for thousands of pounds. The one thing that I should say as well is that I sort of went into this thinking that the traveller community was a big part of the problem. Every single police officer I spoke to said that yes, of course, the traveller community is a part of the problem, but it would be a massive mistake to say that it's the entire problem. It's much more organised crime gangs and crime groups.
We certainly see it in Derbyshire, where there has been quite a lot of lamping. Everybody assumes that it comes from people in Manchester or Sheffield, but then of course everybody in the countryside always assumes that wrongfulness comes from the cities. But I have on more than one occasion been out purposely to disrupt people lamping across fields, including my own fields, which you can quite easily, if you go running out there, shine torches in all directions, they make off quite quickly.
But I was really shocked in your piece, Rupert, about some of the instances of violent retribution against gamekeepers and farmers trying to stop it. There was a gamekeeper in Hampshire who was trailed behind a vehicle, and his legs broken.
Yeah, a gamekeeper, as you say, Lucy, in Hampshire, went out to confront some hare coursers, and the temperature rose, should we say, and he was dragged behind his vehicle and had both of his legs broken. I saw a video in Trowbridge Police Station when I was there. Of a group of hare coursers surrounding a local farmer, driving their car at him. It really is. I don't know. I think the police were very keen to push this idea that it's really not just a few guys out, and don't think about this as a kind of a bit of fun. It's a lot more serious than that.
Just finally, Sam Criss writes the arts lead for the magazine this week, and he looks at conspiracy theories, or rather a new exhibition about them at the Warburg Institute that is trying to make sense of them. I would love to start by asking you, Matthew, because I think you're a writer who is, you so often you push back against a consensus. It's one of the things that makes you such a great writer for The Spectator. So surely you must therefore see an appeal in something like conspiracy theory, which is so often a rejection of a mainstream opinion.
Yes, I am fascinated by conspiracy theories. I've had 2 bouts of paranoia in my own life. One, when I was about to do a free-fall parachute jump, obviously strapped onto a professional jumper, and as it was over Hawaii, and as our plane circled up into the sky, I became convinced that this was a conspiracy to kill me and that he was not buckling us together properly and that I was going to be dropped. Completely absurd.
Why in your brain at the in that moment was he trying to kill you?
I don't know why. Probably because I was afraid, because you are afraid before you do something like that.
Did you jump?
I did jump, yes. No, I did jump. And when I was at university as an undergraduate, there was a guy in the room next to me who believed that the neighbours were trying to kill him with a death ray. He once came into my room and said that the death ray's on again, they're trying to kill me again. Come and have a look, come and have a look. So I followed him, and it was somebody's porch light shining through a hedge. And I said, well, that's somebody's porch light shining through a hedge. It's not a death ray. And he said, no, if you're trying to kill somebody with a death ray, you would disguise it, wouldn't you? You would make it like it was shining through a hedge. But all paranoia is the irrational, extreme development of a very useful instinct that human beings have as an animal to look for connections, to join dots up, to suppose that something may be going on that it was not immediately apparent, and it can just go too far.
Yes, and so when it comes to a whole conspiracy theory, perhaps not just believed by one paranoid person, but a whole network of people all connecting to each other online and whatever else. What's the appeal to that, do you think? Is it the same sort of instinct then? It's the joining of dots, it's the explanation is more comforting, even if it's a scary explanation.
Everybody wants to believe that there are conspiracies. We all do. And what social media can now do is join all those people together and turbocharge the whole thing.
Yes.
I don't know about you guys, but I certainly have some friends who seem to sort of adopt some conspiracy theories almost as an ironic pose, particularly the moon landings. I sort of feel like probably up a bar you'll find any person say, well, yeah, I mean, I just think they were faked by the government.
That's sort of a harmless one. As conspiracy theories go, it's not exactly, I mean, it's
quite sweet.
It is quite sweet, but, and of course, on one end of the spectrum, you've got really damaging conspiracy theories like the anti-vax movement, which I think does... some people think there is underplayed medical evidence of the harmfulness of vaccines. Some people think, for example, in COVID, the vaccine was Bill Gates trying to put a microchip in your brain. And that's led to, for example, we've seen this outbreak of measles in North London. And that's a disease that kills children, has killed several children in the UK in the past few years because vaccination rates are going down. So it is harmful when it's on that. But I got thinking about this after reading the piece, and I thought, actually, without being too po-faced about it, when you have lots of conspiracy theories on lots of subjects, and there's a sort of a growing echo chamber of the internet that's sort of drawing people in, maybe it does start to become a bit more harmful to society. And I read, I'm sure you guys might also have read, a brilliant book by Peter Pomerantsev called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, about how in Russia, the state poisoned the well, or poisoned public discourse with lots of rival conspiracy theories to create this sense of white noise that the public couldn't believe anything, and therefore a sort of societal cynicism gripped hold that was damaging to the fabric of society and any sort of lingering attempts at sort of democracy to sort of remain rooted in Russia. So
that in itself is a conspiracy theory, though, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't agree it's a conspiracy theory. I think in the way that Pomerantsev sets out how the mass media that was state-affiliated or had links to the state was used in Russia is convincing. I think you might take. You might try to unpick the evidence. I wouldn't call that a conspiracy theory.
I do think it does need to be said, though, that there have been occasions where something which has for quite a while and by a lot of reputable people been dismissed as a conspiracy theory has turned out to be true, or at least very plausible. I mean, the most obvious one that Matt Ridley has written about a lot for The Spectator is the COVID lab leak theory from Wuhan, which for a good year of the start of the pandemic was dismissed by all the great and the good as being just total sort of xenophobic conspiracy theory. But now it's certainly not a fringe position anymore, and I think there's a lot of quite serious people who do say it's plausible. So
and look at QAnon. Almost everything that they said turns out to be at least partly true. You know, like the pizza references, it's all there.
Well, that's true. The Epstein emails. Just to go back to the Epstein emails, they talk about pizza.
They do
a lot in a very suspicious and creepy way. Exactly. There's a lot of references to pizza in there.
It's the old gag. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not all out to get you.
Yes.
You know, I just agree with Lucy that there are different tiers of conspiracy theories, but I mean, at the lower end, it's just great fun, and it's I was on a stag do recently, and someone said, "Oh, well, obviously the Israelis killed Charlie Kirk," and immediately someone's like, "Well, you would say that, wouldn't you?" And the conversation lit up from there. Don't ask me.
That was a fun conversation.
Yeah, that was my stag do highlight. But I think there's just there's a theory, and I think it's probably a very sound theory, that people who are interested in conspiracy are doing so to find order in the world. Lost people seeking reason. I think that's probably true in a lot of the cases, but let's not forget as well that it's also just a way of finding some fun in the world. Conspiracies.
Chemtrails.
Exactly.
Yes.
Conspiracies don't need to be. They don't need to be harmful. It can just be a disappearance down a rabbit hole.
Do you have a favourite conspiracy then, or one that you think might actually be weirdly plausible?
Well, I'm also from Wiltshire, like Lucy, so I'm mad keen on crop circles. And, yeah, strong. I mean, I've seen the videos of people making them with boards and all the rest of it, but it doesn't do it for me.
I love Rupert's idea of fun on a stag party.
Yeah, you can defend Epstein, but you cannot go on a stag do that badly.
But I also think it's worth drawing a distinction between people who believe something to be true and disseminate their evidence for that theory, and some, particularly in the States, who have big followings online, who my impression is they're just entirely cynical and are sort of selling what they believe their idiot followers will swallow without themselves actually believing it, which I think is...
Although, do they start to believe it? Do you know what I mean?
Like, self-radicalise, maybe.
Yeah, you sort of start to believe your own propaganda, even though you know it's propaganda. Like a bit like a dictator.
Yes.
I once had my hair cut by a man who had the wildest conspiracy theory I've ever heard in terms of the connections. I just loved it. It started with, do you remember the slap at the Oscars where Will Smith slapped Chris Rock for insulting his wife? That was all faked, obviously. But the reason it was faked was it was the CIA trialing deception techniques to use on the general public, which they would then employ years later to fake Donald Trump's assassination attempt in 2024.
Makes total sense to me.
Yes. Well, you never know.
I love that. Matthew, Lucy, and Rupert, thank you very much indeed for joining me, and thank you very much for watching.